And by wildfire risk, what I mean is all the activities that are associated both with pre-fire mitigation and reduction of wildfire risk, and everything that goes on with the suppression of wildfire as well. And so I want to get started by asking you, the audience, to let us know how much of your current workload actually involves managing wildfire risk. So we're going to have a polling question pop up for that.
Hopefully everybody can see that. Go ahead and vote. We'll give it another 10 seconds. We have 412 people in our meeting room, and about half have voted. So go ahead and chime in, everybody. 5, 4. Okay. All right. And all right, end the poll and share the results. Can you guys all see that?
Okay, interesting. So a little less than half of folks actually aren't managing wildfire risk in their work, and some others have it as a portion of their work. Only about 9% have it as a majority, and 6% or 17 of you do it 100% of the time. Okay, that's great to know. Thank you. Okay. Even if you don't work in managing wildfire risk, if you're involved in forest management or land management in any way, you're probably familiar though with this common refrain, right? Which is we have to increase the pace and scale of forest restoration and fuels reduction in order to address our wildfire problem. So this means we're going to have to manage more acres. We're going to have to do it faster. And we're going to have to work at spatially larger scales and across ownership boundaries, right? Because things like fire don't obey lines that we've made on maps. And there's also a common refrain about what we think we need in order to overcome that problem. We think we need things like more time, more technology to process fuels, more money, more capacity. All these things are true. We also know that what we need to do is work together because wildfire is a collective action problem. Like I said, it crosses boundaries, it affects multiple actors. So it's a collective action problem, meaning that multiple affected actors are working together. So as a result, we also often hear about social factors that we need to reduce wildfire risk. We hear a lot about trust, the need to sort of believe in each other, be able to work together, social license, the willingness of stakeholders to support land managers making decisions, networks that allow us to come together to get things done. So those social interactional factors, time, money, resources, all of that, we know those are key ingredients. But as social science and extension practitioners, which Tony, Darren, and all are, in our experience and in our research, we think that all of those are necessary factors, but they're not going to be sufficient unto themselves, and more is needed. So when we think about how we can have durable, cross-boundary, really integrated management of something as complex as fire risk, there's also a need to think about what's going to bridge different organizations. We have different organizations with diverse structures, missions, and mandates. And they act differently. So how do we actually bridge that as well? I don't need to tell you, but I will, that governing wildfire risk is organizationally complex. So you have a landscape you may want to reduce fire risk in. It contains multiple entities that are undertaking a variety of actions from pre-fire mitigation all the way through post-fire response. So you might have different agencies that scales from the local to the federal that are managing different types of resources, land and water, wildlife, et cetera. You can also have civic society entities like homeowners associations, nonprofit groups, collaborative groups, those are all present as well. And even though we have a lot of strategies that call for more cohesive, collaborative efforts, these entities still differ, right? They have different missions, they have different mandates, they have different cultures and processes. Our home entities really have ways they act and behave. And so there's boundaries, right, between our organizations, which are as important, we think, as the boundaries on the ground that we talk about a lot. Boundaries also exist too between what we call action arenas. So between mitigation and suppression. Even when you have an entity that actually works on both mitigation and suppression, there can be silos within that entity. So for example, the US Forest Service, fuels reduction and mitigation activities occur in an entirely different area of that agency than fire suppression does. So there can be challenges in connecting those. I want to ask now if you're familiar with the concept of boundary spanning in any context. Go ahead and take that polling question once Megan pops it up.
You should all see that on your screen. Seems like people are voting. I can see everybody voting in real time, and right now no is winning. So if you know what
Oh.
boundary spanning is, please chime in. Well, you should chime in anyways, but.
Well, it's great that you're on this webinar then. That's what we're here for.
Yes. All right, here we go. Share the results.
Okay, awesome. Good to know. Okay. So that's great because today the learning objectives for this webinar are to be able to, for you to be able to recognize different types and functions of boundary spanning that allow us to work together, and then maybe identify some potential applications for your own efforts. So that's what we're going to be covering today. Here's a roadmap for what to expect from us. First, I'll share a typology of boundary spanning attributes. This is a framework we're going to use to understand those, and we'll be returning to it throughout the webinar today, so it should help guide you. I'm going to really briefly introduce our research project. Then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Tony, to talk about some of our case studies, and then to our colleague, Darren. And then I'll wrap up with some implications and applications as well. So to start, I'll share this typology of boundary spanning attributes. We tried to think of a clever way to make it easier for you to remember what these were, and I'll be walking through each of them in a second, calling this the Scopa model. These are different attributes that in different ways allow us to span boundaries. And again, when I'm talking about boundaries, I'm not just talking about boundaries on the ground. I'm talking about how different organizations that are set up differently can actually work together collectively. So this is the Scopa model of boundary spanning attributes. The S in Scopa stands for settings. So these are the conducive broader drivers or enablers, things you can draw on to help make your boundary spanning work possible. For example, this could be policies or efforts like the National Cohesive Wildfire Strategy. The second, the C in Scopa is concepts. So concepts are framings that allow there to be common meanings and understandings, even if you're coming from a different background or a different set of expertise, right? We've seen a lot of organization and a lot of people rallying around the idea that wildfire has been uncharacteristic. And we've also seen a lot of rallying around the idea of fire adapted communities. Those concepts allow people, even with different backgrounds, to really agree on what an issue is at hand and work together on it. The O in Scopa is objects. These are actually material items that allow us to bridge gaps and do things like transfer resources or codify agreements. So that might be something like a memorandum of understanding that lays out how you're going to work together. Or it might be a contract or an agreement that actually allows funds to be moved from one place to another, right? Trust is really important. Things like that are really important. But if you can't sometimes move dollars to make things happen, you don't have boundary spanning. The P in Scopa is people or organizations. This is really big in the scientific literature. Boundary spanning organizations is something we know a lot about as social scientists. These are entities, people or organizations that actually do that work of facilitating and sustaining connections. They might be in coordinator type positions. They might exist to help translate policy or scientific information into practice. And then finally, activities. So this is working together to perform related or collective tasks. So engaging and working together on an activity, the folks in this picture are actually doing a mapping exercise together. So to remind you again, that's the Scopa model: settings, concepts, objects, people, and activities. And this is a way that we're trying to explain some of the boundary spanning attributes that work in wildfire risk management. And soon we're going to talk about how those actually function using specific examples that will bring it to life. I'm going to talk about our research project now, which is where the information that we're sharing in this webinar comes from. I'm going to move through this pretty quickly because I'd like to get to the examples and to my colleagues. If anyone has any questions about the project, though, I encourage you to follow up with me. This is work we've been doing with support from the Joint Fire Science Program. I'd really like to recognize their important support of fire social science. And this is our full project team. Darren and Tony and I are there on the left, and then our colleagues from the University of Oregon, Heidi Huber-Stearns, and Mike Caggiano from Colorado State University are there on the right. They're not with us today. At this point, we're drawing on a few sources of information for this study, and one is case studies of large landscapes where there are entities working together to try to reduce wildfire risk. We chose these case studies to have some things in common. So they're all large landscapes that have recent histories of large fires that affected multiple ownerships, that had multiple agencies responding, and that have evidence of collaboration and partnerships. But they also show some variability in their spatial size, their social ecological context, and the exact ownership pattern on the ground. These case studies occurred in southeastern Oregon, southwestern Idaho, southern Utah, northern Colorado, and northern New Mexico. I won't bore you with all of the social science details, but again, follow up if you have questions. We gathered a lot of documents related to wildfire risk management in each area. We've conducted interviews in each of those case study areas with involved actors, and we've also done some mapping exercises to understand spatial patterns of land ownership, wildfire, and treatments in those areas. It's a total of 100 interviews, and to identify common themes and findings across those interviews, we've used in vivo qualitative analysis software. I'm going to turn it over to Tony now to start talking about two of our cases in Colorado and New Mexico and how some of those boundary spanning attributes played out in those cases. So take it away, Tony.
Okay, thanks. Can people see me?
Yep, we can see you.
Okay. Can you see my background? I can't see myself at this point, but can you see my background?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So for those of you who may be wondering, this is a photo taken by a member of a hotshot crew from the Pike National Forest of the West Fork fire that burned in southern Colorado in 2013. And it was one of those days where the fire hit a fairly large patch of spruce that had been killed by the spruce bark beetle that we're dealing with here in Colorado. So I'm going to walk through a couple of case studies that really focused on kind of the mitigation side, and one of the boundary concepts around that was mitigating fire risk in order to conserve and protect source water for domestic and agricultural uses. And there you see on the map here the two case study locations, one in northern Colorado that encompasses a mix of land ownerships, and then one in northern New Mexico that encompasses areas that feed into the Rio Grande River. So you can transfer the slide. So just zooming in, we really wanted to focus these our case studies on some focusing events that Emily Jane talked about, these large severe wildfires. And these two cases in particular are really jump out because they have really affected those water supplies. The one here in northern Colorado, you can see on the map the mix of land ownerships. So we do have those ownership boundaries, and the fire footprint that you see is the High Park fire. That's the big blob that burned in 2012, but then you can also see various other fires that have burned in this landscape across boundaries. And those fires have really contributed to issues for domestic water supplies. And moving to the next slide is also an example from the Santa Fe area. This is kind of a zoomed out map of the upper Rio Grande River watershed. And right in the middle of that area is the fires that have burned over a succession of years, but one of the more recent large ones is the Los Conchas fire that burned in 2011. And down on the lower right hand, you can see the fire severity map and how it affected all of these drainages that flow into the Rio Grande, which supplies water for a variety of domestic and agricultural and industrial purposes downstream. And lots of concern in terms of the biophysical resources, but obviously its effect on social and economic values for those downstream users. So next. So one of the things that we as we entered the case study, we really wanted to characterize, okay, these fire events have occurred. They have really raised the awareness around these risks. So you have these existing kind of ecosystem of organizations that are operating around fire management and fire risk mitigation, some on private lands, some on federal lands. And if you move to the next slide, this is an example of the range of organizations that are working on the Northern Colorado case study. We call it the Northern Colorado Fireshed. area. And so you have everything from nonprofit organizations like the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed. You have a variety of fire responders from local or volunteer and local fire protection agencies. Also, the state of Colorado has fire responders. And then you have a variety of larger kind of land managers, from the Forest Service to the Colorado State Forest Service, some research organizations like the one I run at Colorado State. And so you have all these organizations that are responding to these events, but they're not well connected. And we've sort of saw that as coming out of our interviews prior to a lot of these events. They're kind of working more in parallel. So move next slide. So when EJ talks about the Scopa model, each of those are attributes of boundary spanning. But one of the things that we saw out of the case studies is how they work together. So each one of them are important, they're necessary, but they're not sufficient in and of themselves. They all combine and interact to create boundary spanning conditions. So one of the things that we saw in both of our case studies were a set of activities that were facilitated by organizations working around producing certain kinds of boundary objects. So I'll work through all of those separately, but then you'll get an idea of how they all fit together. So the first set of activities that really jumped out was from the Northern Colorado Fireshed group. If you move on to the next slide, one of them is the importance of just getting people around maps, and a lot of us that work in the space, not only in wildfire but perhaps in other land and resource management, maps become very important devices around which different people from different organizations and missions and values can sit around and start communicating values and needs and priorities. And so one of the boundary spanning activities that came out is in the fairly recent development called the Potential Operational Delineations Framework. We call it PODS. And first of all, our interview subjects talked about how important PODS were because it generated and were related to three other boundary spanning important items. So one is that it is a science-based framework. It utilizes the best available data and science around fire risk assessment and spatial data. But then it's overlaid on top of local knowledge. And so on the left-hand screen, you can see a variety of participants from community-based fire organizations, from the local watershed cooperative group to federal and state fire responders, all getting around and delineating areas on a map of where they thought their best opportunities for managing fire would be during an incident. And then that gets combined with some more technical fire risk modeling and some other features that have some spatial data associated with them. And what the middle slide shows is the product is a set of geographically delineated polygons that represent different potential opportunities for managing wildfire in different ways depending on the conditions. And what that allows is it sets the stage for some pre-fire planning for a variety of different organizations with different mandates and values and capacities to start having conversations about how they would respond to an ignition on a certain day, on a certain condition, on a certain set of weather conditions, depending on where it is on the landscape. And then they would already have an agreement about what to do with that. Okay, and so as a way to really cross those organizational boundaries has been a very powerful opportunity. The last picture on the right there is a set of prospective, planned, collaborative prescribed burn projects. So not only has the pods been used to pre-plan wildfire incidents, but it's also used to define where some prescribed fire might work for both fire risk reduction, fuels reduction, as well as for producing ecological benefits. And so this framework, this set of activities has really cultivated a much broader range of opportunities for different organizations to work together. So next slide. A lot of activities like the pods and other collaborative planning ends up producing objects. And the objects that we have identified through our case study are basically plans, whether they are comprehensive watershed scale plans for prioritizing fuel reduction activities, the mitigation or suppression plans that come out of the pods planning framework, and then there are a variety of other documents that really memorialize opportunities and methods for how different organizations are going to work together on this landscape. So next slide. So here you have a few examples from our New Mexico case study, where you have the Rio Grande Water Fund becomes is in one of those boundary spanning organizations. But a couple of the objects that have been produced is a comprehensive plan. And on the right-hand side of that are the signatories, these advisory boards, sorry, that help contribute to that plan. So it really encompasses a whole range of organizations and interests and values. And then on the lower right hand is a monitoring and adaptive management plan as a way for these entities to define explicitly what success looks like and how you're going to go about measuring it. So these plans are really ends up being memorials of shared commitments and a shared vision for what they want to do together. Next slide. The C in Scopa, it refers to concepts. And so if you move to the next slide, I'll just show you some examples of some concepts. EJ talked a little bit about it, but especially around this fire risk and water connection. We saw surface out of our interviews several kind of boundary spanning concepts. So these are ideas or ways of speaking, of creating narratives that bring a lot of people from different organizations together. So one that's very important, and I pulled this off of a water fund website that's up here in northern Colorado, the Peaks to People Waterfront, is this notion that that we need to invest in kind of investing in preventative activities has a likelihood of reducing future costs, and we can avoid what those costs would be into the future. And so it really has tried to create an incentive and a motivating set of ideas that an ounce of prevention forestalls a pound of payment later, those kinds of things. The other thing that we also hear that we've heard a lot about is that wildfire risk, because it doesn't pay attention to ownership or jurisdictional boundaries, is a problem that's shared by all of us, right? It's almost like what we call a common pool resource problem, that it's so large that no one single entity can mitigate those risks, and it really requires everybody to be involved. And that really has become a space that's drawn in a whole variety of organizations and entities. Next slide. And then we have what's called boundary spanning organizations in both of our case studies, whether they are these water funds like the Rio Grande Water Fund, the Peaks to People Water Fund. There's a variety of these kind of water funds, and what these really look like are they are a collection of beneficiaries of clean water downstream, and they pool resources to invest in preventative and mitigation activities upstream. So doing things like reducing tree density, doing prescribed fire, doing lots of activities that can mitigate the negative effects of an inevitable fire on water supplies and water users. And so it's one of those kind of boundary spanning organizations that span the downstream users from the upstream managers of these watershed values. Down in here in Colorado, as well as in New Mexico, they're what's called fire shed coalitions. Many of you are familiar with watershed councils or watershed groups. Fire sheds are kind of operated on the same principle, that there are geographic areas that are subject to similar kinds of burning conditions, and that affect a whole variety of resources within that area. We call them fire sheds. So if you move to the next slide, these are the organizations that span those boundaries. And so on the left is the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative. This is a still fairly nascent organization that's only been around for about 1.5 years or so. And there you have the logos of some of the primary participants that kind of span those organizational missions and values and capacities, but together they really lever each other to form this Fireshed Collaborative that really work across those ownership boundaries. And so you have science and management boundaries also mitigated and lowered. That's also an important part of it. And then on the right is again the advisory board list for the Rio Grande Water Fund. That really is another one of those boundary spanning organizations within which you have a variety of entities kind of coming and going and contributing in different ways. So next slide. So just kind of, presenting some preliminary results from our study and looking at how, as we move from these focusing events that really spur the sort of incentivize and motivate people to work together, but working together across these organizational boundaries is really hard. And so what are some of those boundary spanning attributes that we've seen that really facilitate working together? And so, right, having different settings and concepts and objects can rework how people interact together, and then they create different boundary objects, new boundary objects that then memorialize their commitments to work together, and then that spurs a reworking of how they think about their work together, and then actually producing activities and hopefully work on the ground together, such as burning across ownership boundaries through cross-boundary cooperative prescribed fire. So last slide of mine. Some challenges that were surfaced out of our interviews is it does add a layer of having to interact with other people. And so this is kind of other duties in addition to the work that people are already doing. And there's definitely a sense that there's a lot of meetings that people have to go to, and that contributes to some meeting fatigue. A lot of those meeting goers are kind of those individuals within organizations that believe in what they're trying to do collectively. And so they really rely on those individuals taking those personal risks to get involved, and it really hasn't been institutionalized yet within their broader organizations. And so that third point really refers that there's these gravitational pulls of all of our home organizations, that even though we might want to be involved in collaborative groups and projects, we also have our own performances and missions and priorities and targets and outcomes that we have to pay attention to in our home organization. So that there was a lot of recognition among our interviewees that that's a tension. And then there's really, when you start really looking at these cross-boundary and collaborative entities and enterprises out there, there's an increasing competition for limited resources to do this kind of work, right? So you have individual entities like U.S. Forest Service or state forestry entities that still are competing for their own resources for dollars. And now you have another collaborative entity that's also entering into that competitive space. So there's some barriers and challenges to overcome there. So that's the case studies, 2 case studies on fire and water. So I think we'll hand it over to Darren.
Thank you. And thank you, Emily Jane. So the area I'm going to talk about is here in southwestern Utah, or there in southwestern Utah. I'm actually located in Logan, in the opposite corner of Utah. And so from this map, on the left side of the screen would be Nevada, and just another county to the south is Arizona. The Dixie National Forest is in the middle here, with Bryce National Park and parts of Zion National Park, and also the Cedar City, Utah, and Panguitch, Utah, are all located in this case study. This is our so-called fire shed. And the Bryan Head fire happened in this area, 70,000 acre fire about 3 years ago. So that was relevant to this area. So these are Garfield and Iron counties in southwestern Utah, and they're very rural counties with 8,500 square miles, and vegetation types that include sagebrush, pinyon juniper, ponderosa, and higher elevation aspen. We call them Quakies here in Utah, and mixed conifer. And it's mostly federally owned land that we're talking about, and it's a mixture of jurisdictions, of federal jurisdictions, including the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, the U.S. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then mixing in with that is the Utah Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. That's mostly responsible for private lands, in addition to municipal and county governments and local governments. So it's quite a mix here. Thank you, Emily Jane. And so this is called Color Country. And here's the field office with all those different agencies that I just listed. And I want to go through some of the facilitating factors that helped with boundary spanning here in Utah. And in some ways, of all the case studies we've done, we think that some of the stronger boundary spanning between agencies is going on here. And here I'm going to provide maybe some of the reasons why that is. And part of it is this interagency fire center, this infrastructure for interagency activities with Iron and Garfield counties. And so there's a formal structure with the 5 agencies that I've already listed, and the state agency, Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. And this includes some agreements that allow the sharing of equipment and personnel across those boundaries, regardless of the fire origin. So these are important facilitating factors. And another one includes the strong fire operational relationships between the agencies and the people. The leadership, the fire management officers, FMOs from each agency meets monthly throughout the year, and that regular contact fosters a closer relationship and dialogue for proactively addressing different challenges. And these FMOs have remained pretty consistent in those positions. Limited turnover, which is a significant issue in other places. And it's a bit of an issue here too, but less so. And we think that's really important towards that boundary spanning, those long-term relationships that people have, and that culture of those relationships. And it adds to the durability of them, and that really is important. Another facilitating factor is a lot of the personnel in this area have diverse agency experience. In some places I've worked at, and maybe even here still, I'm not sure, it's a little bit looked down upon to switch from the Forest Service to the BLM, for example. But here, there's a lot of that has gone on and continues to go on. So it's perhaps more accepted. That you have worked for the Park Service or the BLM, and now you're working for the Forest Service, and people are starting to see the value in that as well. And that's kind of a new thing in federal agencies, I think, from my perspective, and because that provides those people with a more diverse perspective about the different missions, the mandates, and the cultures within the various organizations. And that really helps foster cooperation amongst the agencies. And I touched on this earlier, but I want to emphasize the pre-season planning and the communications that go on. These folks work together before and after the fire season. That groundwork is really important for the cooperation and for those relationships. For example, fire management agency personnel hold meetings with folks like county commissioners and local fire departments. That's really important. And at these meetings, we go over the maps, as Tony talked about, and talk about different issues that show up on the map and the values at risk in those conversations and the priorities of different suppression strategies that guide this conversation. And throughout the year, there's other meetings within the Color Country Fuels Committee and the local catastrophic wildfire reduction strategy committee, in addition to the Utah Watershed Restoration Initiative. And these meetings help prioritize our fuels reduction and mitigation activities in certain focal areas, and that further emphasize the shared values at risk. But on the other hand, there are limiting factors, of course. And I mentioned that the low turnover is an advantage and a strength here, but there is some turnover, and that is a limiting factor. Despite the strong consistency that we've had, the turnover that does exist makes it a lot harder for those staff that serve as administrators in these agencies and on incidents. If you can't rely on that relationship that you've developed, and there's a new person there, and there's maybe a different social process in place now with the new person, it makes the fire operations a little more challenging. Next slide. Thank you. Another limiting factor is the difference in suppression mandates within agencies. For example, the State Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, their mandate is to put fires out on private lands. It's pretty simple. But of course, the Park Service and the Forest Service, they have other values they want to get out of a fire that they might manage for a fire. So that can provide challenges. And these differences are understood and respected within this interagency context, but at the same time can inhibit that management of cross-boundary fires, especially for uniform objectives. One more, please. And finally, the final limiting factor I want to talk to is shared risk. And although the fire management agencies cooperate within the interagency context there in southwestern Utah, there's also inherent limits to sharing those risks. Those limits come from established legal and statutory rules, and within the agency, the protection authority for the lands where a fire originated. And a big part of this can be in sharing costs across agency boundaries. That can pose a big challenge to a fire manager, and that can depend on the affected jurisdictions and the management objectives within that jurisdiction. And then for my final slide of my portion, I want to talk a little bit more about lessons in Southwest Utah. The fire suppression partnerships appear to benefit from the presence of that interagency fire center and that culture of relatively low personnel turnover and strong interpersonal relationships among the fire groups. And these conditions may not exist in all places, but that culture that encourages co-management and suppression can still be supported with deliberate efforts to ensure regular dialogue through those winter meetings, those off-season planning events. And this can include institutionalizing some of those events, those pre-season discussions of values at risk and standard processes for communication among agencies, between agencies and the public, and those regular meetings amongst fire management officers. This helps keep a shared, it helps to keep a shared detail, notes and maps and objects that we've referred to, memos. These artifacts are really important to preserve the institutional memory, so that when you do have a little bit of turnover, there's some consistency there. And that's my portion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Darren. I'm going to finish with talking about what we've learned from our cases in a rangeland context, and then offer some final findings and wrap up. What I think is exciting about boundary spanning attributes is you can find them in different ecological and landscape contexts. So we found them not only in lands primarily managed by the Forest Service, forested lands, but also in rangelands. So we looked at how federal fire managers and ranchers working on the land were working together on fire suppression in our two cases that were located in Harney County in southeastern Oregon and Owyhee County in southwestern Idaho. These cases have similar contexts in that they both have large areas of federal land that are managed by the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM. And then ranchers are able to graze cattle as permittees on those lands, as well as on their own lands. Both these places have experienced a lot of really large wildfires. There's concern with protecting habitat for the greater sage grouse, and communities tend to be pretty remote and dispersed across large areas. In both those places, there's also been a lot of conflict actually around fire response. I call it historical tension. So a lot of that has come from, even if a fire starts on ground where the BLM is the land manager and therefore the entity that's supposed to be responsible for responding to that wildfire, ranchers are often much closer to that fire, and it's threatening things that matter to them. It's threatening their cattle, it's threatening the forage their cattle are going to be using. So they often would leap into action and take steps to try to suppress it. This posed a lot of liability and safety concerns for the Bureau of Land Management, and it posed a lot of frustration for ranchers when they were told you're not supposed to do that. So to help with that issue and to actually capture the advantages that ranchers do offer in being often the first ones to be at a fire when it starts, there's been a number of rangeland fire protection associations that have formed, or RFPAs. These are found not just in our case study areas, which are roughly outlined in blue, but also across larger areas of Oregon and Idaho. These are volunteer nonprofit associations of ranchers that form, and they allow ranchers to receive the training and authority that they need to respond to fires on federal, state, and private ground, and then to coordinate with the other fire suppression agencies in doing so. So it provides a way to try to formalize their participation and make it safer. The RFPA model is an interesting example of how you span boundaries because it requires something from different types of actors. So for example, state governments provide the statutory basis that allows ranchers to respond to fire on state and federal land. They are able to host the program, provide training. Federal governments, in order to work with RFPAs, federal governments and RFPAs have to sign either cooperating agreements in Idaho or memorandum of understanding in Oregon. And these boundary objects actually codify that. And they also provide training and access to federal equipment through surplus programs. And then finally, ranchers contribute a lot. So they pay dues to the nonprofit, which allows the purchase of liability insurance. They also contribute all their own time, equipment, and water. No one's paying them to be on those fires, and it's time spent away from their home operations and their families. So we found that by actually creating a formal new organizational structure of an RFPA in both Harney and Owyhee County, there were a lot of positive outcomes. Major one was generally a change in relationships between ranchers and federal fire managers. And again, we're primarily talking about the BLM. This happened largely because the structure allowed for the reduction of some of those liability and safety concerns that the agency had. And it allowed harnessing of that rancher asset, all the local knowledge that they have, their ability to respond to a fire quickly. And it allowed ranchers and firefighters to just work together more effectively. It was also a vehicle for demonstrating and earning respect. So as ranchers spent more time with firefighters on the fire lines, they started to understand why and how different decisions are made and how fire behavior works and other things like that. and more time spent with ranchers, both in training and on the fire line, helped federal fire managers appreciate all the local knowledge and contributions that ranchers could make and come to see them as an asset rather than a liability. But we found in Harney County that the establishment of RFPAs, which had occurred over time there, wasn't sufficient to reduce all of this conflict. There was quite a lot of tension that remained, some of it around following fire line safety and protocols, some of it around the management of large incidents. So those of you who are involved in fire risk know that when a federally managed fire gets large enough, you bring in an external team, not from the local area, you get additional resources to kind of manage that fire. Those non-local teams didn't know who these ranchers on the fire were and what was going on, didn't communicate with them. And then there continued to be disagreement about the actual tactics and strategies being used for suppression. So how you're actually fighting the fire, you know, where you're going direct on it versus taking a more conservative approach. So that all kind of suggested to folks in Harney County there was a need for more substantial dialogue, not just on the fire line, but off the fire line to try to figure out some of these issues. And there was a shared sense because of some of the extremely large fires that occurred in Harney County in 2012 and following years, that these large fires were increasingly occurring. This was a problem that wasn't going to go away. And so there was a shared desire to reduce the risks of those fires. So members of the Rangeland Fire Protection Associations in Harney County, along with leaders from the Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Fish and Wildlife managing the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, and other agencies and local entities went ahead and formed what we call a collaborative group. We talk a lot about collaborative groups in the context of federal forest management. That's where we use that term collaborative as a noun more commonly. These are multi-stakeholder groups that get together, usually in a meeting room, sometimes on a field tour, and they have dialogue about the different values they have, usually trying to reach agreement about planned management activities on national forests. Here we're talking about a similar dialogue-based approach, but in the context of rangelands and wildfire. So the group did things like they actually just did the hard work of talking through the problems that I described in the last slide. They came up with written agreements about them and how they wanted them to be addressed, plans for how to address them, always writing these down and documenting and memorializing them. So these included things like new processes for how our RFPAs, new agreements for how RFPAs would interface with non-local incident management teams, the creation of a dedicated RFPA liaison position at the Bureau of Land Management, so a boundary person whose job is just to liaise with the RFPAs, and the undertaking of a joint activity, joint training with the Bureau of Land Management to build that training and understanding together. The collaborative also realized that it wasn't enough to just talk about how to fight fires. They also wanted to stop those fires from starting. So they sort of crossed that boundary from suppression over to the arena of mitigation. They did some mapping exercises, so boundary spanning there, those activities, to choose a high priority landscape that they wanted to work in. And then they worked to analyze strategic fuel break locations and map out where we should best put fuel breaks on the landscape. The BLM went through its environmental analysis process for that area because this area was largely owned by the BLM. And the collaborative group provided written documentation of what they agreed on, what kinds of techniques they wanted to see used to make these fuel break locations, where they wanted them to be, all of that. They also came up with a plan for how they would monitor the implementation of all of that. And now they've moved on to choose a second priority landscape from their mapping activities that's going to involve mixed ownerships. So when you go back to our Scopa model and you map what happened in Harney County onto it, I think it's pretty cool because it shows that all of these different boundary spanning attributes came into play in some ways, that all of them were necessary, and also that the approach in this county relies on some types of boundary spanning more than others. So for example, in Harney County, there's a lot of reliance on boundary spanning people or organizations. And a collaborative approach. So we have a nonprofit intermediary it's a nonprofit that actually helps sort of support and be the backbone for the collaborative efforts there. We have things like that RFPA liaison that I mentioned. There's cooperative extension from Oregon State University that plays a big role in bringing science into the collaborative efforts. Other aspects, other boundary spanning attributes were really important too, of course. You couldn't have RFPAs have a boundary setting, which was the Oregon statute that allows rangeland fire protection associations to exist. And the concept of mega fires was really important for bringing folks together and saying, this is enough, these fires are too big, they're happening too frequently, and they're affecting too many of us. So that really helped glue together the motivation. the use of MOUs and agreements also just really helped continue to codify, this is what we agree on, here's how we're going to work on that. So all of those boundary spanning attributes in the Scopa model are really important. I'm going to wrap up with you and applications. I appreciate you journeying with us through Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Oregon today. And we think that this stuff can also journey with you back to your home states and countries. I think it's pretty clear that across cases, there were focusing events that had significant impacts. So large wildfires in all of the cases. In Oregon and or in New Mexico and Colorado in particular, it wasn't just the wildfires, it was the effects on water supply and floods and things that followed. But impacts that were significant enough to enough people and what mattered to them that it was able to stimulate multiple types of boundary spanning activities, organizations, et cetera. But that also required the commitment and resources that were necessary to sustain and institutionalize that action and keep that action going. So this was things like boundary objects that actually keep allowing resources to be shared, as we've talked about, or boundary concepts that were allowing everyone to see an issue similarly enough that they actually were able to take that collective action. I think we've said it a few times throughout, but I'll bring it home again. All of the boundary spanning attributes in the Scopa model have their own roles to play. The timing and flavor of combination of them, the sequencing of them is going to look different in different places because different places are different. Some places are very action oriented. So they might jump into doing some shared activities like a mapping exercise or a prioritization exercise, and then try to think about how they're going to act on what they learn from that, right? Other places might really want to start by building a collaborative group and talking through dialogue. So the take home is that you need more than one of these ingredients. Some may be more necessary than others at different times and places. A couple polling questions for you as we start to finish up here. On that theme that the different boundary spanning attributes are important at different times, when you've been getting collective action going in your work, so at the early stages, has any of these boundary spanning attributes been more important than others? What's been the most important for helping you actually get things going or initiate collective action in your work?
Votes are coming in. Y'all should see a poll on your screen. Please let us know your thoughts on this. I'm going to leave the poll open for another couple seconds. And while I have your attention, hey, Tony, I know you're working hard in the background to address some questions. So what I'm thinking is, since I will have to wrap this up at 10 after the hour, maybe if you want to roll through a couple of the top questions and just kind of read off what you've answered or summarize them, that might be great towards the very end of this webinar, if that sounds good to you. Because I know you're putting work into these and there's no need for me to read them.
Yeah.
You can do a better storytelling job. Okay, so here's the polling results.
Okay, so organizations and people was about over a third of you said those were really important. And I think that the research literature recognizes this too. The majority of research about boundary spanning in the literature talks about organizations and people. And there's also the reality, right, that someone has to do it. Nothing happens if no one's doing it. So that's great. Now I want to ask the same question about sustaining the work. So if things have gotten going, how do you keep them going? Is it the same, or have different boundary spanning attributes become more important? How did you keep people interested? How did you keep the momentum going?
Emily, while people are voting, did you come up with the Scopa framework? I might have missed that in the beginning, or was that something that you used that was a template?
We've come up with the Scopa framework ourselves.
Okay.
So we reviewed academic literature about different types of boundary spanning. And so the terms like settings, concepts, objects, those are out there in the literature. We've pulled them together into this model. That's one of the contributions our project has made, is to pull them together in that model. And I'll give credit where credit is due, that Tony is the one who came up with the acronym.
Cool. All right. A couple more seconds to vote, everybody. And here we go.
So the same as before, I see that some things like activities were a little more important as well, but still organizations and people. And so that does make sense and go along with what we know from the literature. Thank you. I'll wrap up by asking or some questions. I guess these are questions for you that you should ask yourself that you can take home to your work. So maybe after hearing about the Scopa model and these different boundary spanning attributes, you're realizing, okay, we've done a great job at one of these things. We've signed a lot of agreements or something like that. But you're not sure how to take next steps. Maybe you're stalled in your effort and you're not sure why. Maybe you've had great dialogue and agreements, which is pretty common, but you aren't sure how to then act on those. So we hope that these questions will help you think that through. And that if you're feeling stuck, that you might need to move to another type of boundary spanning attribute to move past that. As we wrap up, Megan's going to put these questions in the chat box, but these are items we'd love your feedback on, and you can write your responses into the chat box. We'd love to know if our Scopa model that we used today helped you think about collective action for wildfire risk management in any different or helpful ways. I'm always really curious, you know, are you going to try anything differently at home as a result of what you've learned? And what's that going to be? And then if you have any feedback for us on what could make the model more helpful to you, that would also be great to see. You might find it helpful to go to our project website. We have some other presentations there. We've also developed a fact sheet series, which summarizes our research findings in really accessible ways. And you'll find a lot of what we talked about today in handy 2-page format on the website in those fact sheets. So we suggest you go and visit those. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. I'd like to thank you so much for your time and your interest today, and thank my colleagues for your presentation. And we're really looking forward to your feedback and your questions.
Thanks, EJ. I'm going to launch one final poll. Sorry, everybody. It's just the way we roll in Extension. And if you don't want to answer it right away, no worries. Just drag it to the bottom of your screen while Tony runs through some of the top questions that he's put effort into answering. And you can also follow along if you click on the Q&A window and go to the Answered tab. Those are where we've, Tony and Gloria and I have chimed in a little bit. So go for it, Tony.
Yeah, Patrick Shea from a research professor at University of Utah, a lecturer at Stanford, asked near the end of the webinar, asked the presenters why post-fire treatment wasn't covered in discussing wildland fires. Good collective post-fire actions lessens the chance for future fires. And my response was that during our proposal phase, we talked about, you know, do we include post-fire as part of this larger context we're interested in? And at the time, we didn't, because a lot of the post-fire activities was kind of almost episodic in the sense of kind of post-fire emergency rehabilitation. You know, things like, you know, preventing erosion into streams immediately after the fire. And it just seemed like there was kind of almost a different kind of universe and population of kind of cross-boundary work. But as we got into the case studies, I think what we saw is that all of our case studies emerged out of recent large fires. So we actually are studying the post-fire in order to mitigate the likely consequences of the next fires. And my response was also, this sort of got us thinking about just kind of how they're all kind of connected and related. So thank you for that question. There's a couple other questions about the kind of what are some of the strategies of dealing with these complex issues when you have, you know, increasing development in wildland urban interface. You're seeing kind of, you know, the headline making news out of California, Australia in in the last fire season here. And especially when we're seeing the decline in capacity of a lot of our government agencies that have historically been charged with managing wildfire. And you know, we really haven't talked too much about this in our research team, but I'll give you my personal view is that that one way in which we deal with these limitations and capacity is to have more honest conversations about what is it that we really think we can do in order to mitigate these fire risks in these fire-prone ecosystems. there's, you know, we know that the history of fire suppression, keeping fires small or putting them out, has actually contributed to these large fires. And we will still likely have to do that in a lot of places in order to mitigate those risks. And so being honest and open with what is it that we have to eventually live with? What kinds of fires will we eventually have to live with in the future? Much in the same way as that we can never prevent or, you know, predict earthquakes and tornadoes and hurricanes or those kinds of things. We just have to be able to mitigate those impacts the best we can, and not make promises that we can prevent fires or somehow stop fires like in the ways that we used to historically. And so I think this kind of a shared burden that we have from extension agents to a variety of other organizations that are communicating fire risk education, fire management education, is that there is still a risk that's out there, and things like climate change and expansion of growth in the wild and urban interface are just compound those risks.
And Tony, I want to jump in quickly and add to all of that. The question, I think, was about fires that affect pretty developed or residential areas, the wildland urban interface. And so just another quick thing to throw in there is that means that actors like homeowners associations are really important. It means zoning, whether it's your municipal or your county zoning, those entities become really important. And then finally, insurance agencies and what insurance agencies are going to cover or not cover and how they might incentivize different homeowner behaviors. Those are all going to be important as well.
And all the best to all of you.
Thanks, Megan.
Thanks, Megan.
Bye.